Hey everybody, welcome back to Sip&Talk. I'm Joe. And as always, I'm ready to dive into some seriously juicy info with you all today. It's like we're mixing up a knowledge cocktail here. Strong stuff, but oh, so smooth going down.
And I'm Sunny, your friendly neighborhood fact checker. I'll make sure we get all the ingredients right. Speaking of mixing things up, you know it's always a good blend? Travel whiskey and discovering awesome new things. You have to check out our friend Micky's YouTube channel, Micky to Life.
Yeah, Micky's the best. He's always got something cool going on.
Welcome back, Sip&Talkers. I've got my coffee right here. I'm feeling good, and I am ready to jump into, well, one of the most tangled geopolitical questions out there today.
It's great to be here. And I'll be keeping an eye on that coffee, because today we are getting into some seriously high-stakes, high-volatility strategy.
That is no joke. I mean, for years, it feels like the entire global conversation has been about the countdown clock in the Taiwan Strait.
Right. When is that going to happen?
Exactly. But instead of just guessing when, today we're going to run a kind of a dual-track operation.
I like that. Our mission is really twofold. First up, we're diving into a full-on strategic war game.
The hardcore stuff.
The really hardcore stuff. We're looking at the professional analysis, the kind of modeling that major think tanks are doing on a potential, massive China, U.S., Japan conflict. We have to understand the real military, economic, and political costs if deterrence fails.
And that part is so essential because you have to calculate that unbelievable cost, that catastrophic price tag, before you can get to what I think is the most paradigm-shifting part of our talk today.
It's a thought experiment. That really bold, kind of counterintuitive idea.
Yes. The one that challenges this whole mainstream narrative that Beijing is just, hell-bent on taking Taiwan no matter what it costs.
So the big question we're really digging into is, it's simple, but the implications are just massive for global strategy.
What if Beijing doesn't actually want Taiwan?
And I know that sounds like political heresy. We hear the rhetoric all the time, this rigid talk about national rejuvenation and how unification is an absolute must.
It's non-negotiable, they say.
But when you actually get past the propaganda and you drill down into the cold calculations, the economics, the realpolitik, and maybe most importantly, what the ruling party needs for its own political survival, a very different, much colder picture starts to emerge.
This isn't about passion or ideology. This is about rational self-preservation for a regime that prizes its own survival above everything else.
And we're going to frame this whole argument around four key pillars.
Yeah.
These are ideas being talked about, privately in intelligence and defense circles all over the world.
So what are they?
The first is the catastrophic cost of an invasion. Second, the danger of losing Taiwan as a perfect external enemy. Third is the sort of political poison of trying to absorb a mature democracy.
And the last one.
And the fourth, which is maybe the most telling, is the evidence that Beijing's own actions are actively pushing Taiwan further and further away.
So if you connect all those dots, you're really challenging the entire foundation of U.S. and allied policy today.
Exactly. Is Beijing really after unification, the physical land? Or are they maybe after the topic of unification forever?
The idea that Taiwan might just be this incredibly useful political tool, a permanent excuse, a way to vent nationalist pressure, but not a place they actually want to take over because the risk to the regime is just too high.
That's the core thesis.
All right, so we've got two big moves on the board for the Sip and Talk. First, the brutal math from the war games, then the radical thought experiment.
Let the strategic game begin.
Okay, so let's start there. For a long time, it felt like people were just guessing, but there's been a huge shift in the defense world towards serious analytical wargaming.
A necessary shift.
Right. What happens if deterrence actually fails? And for this, we're looking at really serious work from places like CSIS, the RAND Corporation, CNAS.
That's the crucial pivot. These aren't just one-off games. These institutions run dozens of super detailed iterations of what a conflict could look like. And the consensus is, well, it's uniformly grim, even for the side that wins.
Grim is not a word you want to hear from these guys.
Not at all. And the most famous, most influential analysis on this probably comes from CSIS. They titled their report The First Battle of the Next War. And they ran this specific Taiwan amphibious invasion scenario 24 times to really get a handle on the costs.
24 times. Wow. Can you walk us through what that baseline scenario even looks like? What's the first move on the board?
In almost all of those 24 runs, the conflict kicks off with what the PLA calls fire superiority.
So a massive missile attack.
A massive opening bombardment. China would launch thousands of missiles targeting Taiwan's Air Force, its Navy, its air defense systems, its command centers, all in the first few hours. The goal is just instant paralysis.
And after that?
After that, the PLA Navy, with heavy support from their very powerful rocket force, tries to set up a naval blockade. They want to completely cut the island off from any outside help or supplies.
So you establish air and sea denial first, and only then do you attempt the actual landing, which, I mean, that's got to be one of the most difficult military operations imaginable.
It is unbelievably complex. The invasion force then has to cross the 180-kilometer-wide Taiwan Strait. And, this is a critical detail, the war games assume the PLA would use a mix of military ships and a huge number of civilian vessels.
Civilian ships? Like what?
Ferries, tankers, container ships, anything that can float and carry troops. They'd have to use them to shuttle the tens of thousands of soldiers and all the equipment needed for a full occupation.
Using civilian ships, I mean, that creates all sorts of military and legal problems, but it dramatically increases their ability to move people, doesn't it?
It does, and it forces a terrible decision on the Allies. Do you fire on civilian vessels or do you let an invasion force land?
A nightmare choice.
At the same time, you see PLA air assault units trying to seize key spots like ports and airfields behind the beaches. It's a high-casualty, incredibly complex, and super time-sensitive operation.
And this all leads to what you called the paradox of victory. What is that?
That is the brutal core finding of all these war games. The analysis shows that in most of the scenarios where the U.S. intervenes decisively, the combined U.S., Taiwan, and Japanese forces can actually defeat the invasion.
So they can stop them from taking the island?
They can prevent China from seizing and holding Taiwan, and so they can maintain the island's autonomy.
Okay, so that sounds like a military win. Why do they call it a strategic failure?
Because the cost of that win just makes it completely unsustainable. You can't just look at the battlefield. You have to look at the long-term geopolitical and economic fallout. Winning that battle doesn't mean you've won the war for global order.
All right, let's break down those costs then. What does this victory actually cost the U.S. and its allies? We need to really feel the scale of this.
The Allied losses are they're staggering. The war game reports project U.S. casualties, so personnel killed and wounded, at somewhere between 9,500 and 21,000.
21,000. I mean, for context, that's more than the U.S. lost in Iraq and Afghanistan combined over 2 decades.
Far more. It's a level of attrition the U.S. military hasn't seen since the Korean War.
That's not just a military number. That's a political earthquake. Public support for a war like that would just evaporate if Americans saw thousands of casualties in a matter of weeks.
Absolutely. And beyond the human cost, the U.S. would lose dozens of ships. We're talking cruisers, destroyers, possibly even aircraft carriers, and hundreds of aircraft.
Wow.
Just imagine the damage to America's global standing if a huge chunk of its Pacific fleet was at the bottom of the ocean. One U.S. Navy vice commander who looked at these reports said losing 10 to 20 major ships would cripple the fleet for years. The U.S. global position, its credibility as a deterrent, it would be fractured for decades.
And what about Taiwan itself? I mean, the whole point is to preserve its freedom, but what's left of the island?
Taiwan would be devastated. Even in a successful defense, the island has been hit with a massive, concentrated bombardment. Taiwan's economy, which is the heart of the global semiconductor industry, would be completely wrecked.
And without those chips?
The global economy grinds to a halt. On the island, basic services, electricity, clean water, food, they could all collapse. So even if Taiwan keeps its autonomy, the infrastructure and the economy would take decades to recover.
A worldwide recession that would make 2008 look like a minor blip. Okay, so what about China? They're the aggressor. Their losses must be even worse.
They're catastrophic, to the point of threatening the regime's stability. The war games show the PLA Navy would be, and I'm quoting, in shambles. Their core amphibious forces would be annihilated.
So the ships and crews for the actual landing?
Gone. We're talking about the destruction of most of their specialized transport fleet and tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers potentially becoming prisoners of war. A massive, public, undeniable military humiliation.
Okay, let's pause right there because that connects directly to the second half of our conversation. The analysis specifically says that this level of military failure could destabilize the CCP's rule. Why is that the ultimate fear for Beijing?
Because the entire legitimacy of the CCP, really since Deng Xiaoping, has been built on 2 things: competence and economic growth. A massive military defeat combined with the crushing global sanctions that would be immediate and inevitable.
Way worse than what Russia got.
Far worse. That combination would trigger an economic crisis severe enough to cause massive internal dissent. For a rational autocrat, that level of military and economic ruin is an existential threat to the regime itself. This stops being about a territorial dispute and becomes a question of pure political survival.
Okay, I want to dig into that idea of variables. In these war games, there seems to be one single factor that consistently decides whether the outcome is a technical win for the Allies or a complete disaster.
Japan.
Japan. Why is Japan so incredibly crucial to this whole calculation? It's more than just being a U.S. ally, right?
It's all about cold, hard geography and the laws of naval warfare. First, just look at a map. Taiwan is right next to Japan's southernmost Ryukyu Islands. Yonaguni Island is only 110 kilometers away from Taiwan.
That's nothing. I mean, that's closer than a lot of people's daily commute.
Exactly. And that proximity completely changes the strategic picture. Japan controls these vital geographic choke points that China's Navy has to use for any large-scale operation.
Like the Miyako Strait.
The Miyako Strait is the big one. It's a critical bottleneck for the Chinese Navy to get into the wider Pacific. If China wants to deploy a huge invasion fleet, or even just maintain a long-term blockade, they have to get through or around these straits, which are all basically controlled by Japanese territory.
So if Japan decides to get involved, they're perfectly positioned to be a gigantic and very lethal speed bump.
They are the ultimate speed bump. The Japanese Self-Defense Forces, the JSDF, can use their advanced anti-ship missiles, their submarines, their aircraft. They can effectively destroy Chinese invasion fleets as they're trying to cross the Taiwan Strait.
Oh.
The war games are crystal clear on this. Without the U.S., China probably succeeds. But if you add in even a minimal Japanese intervention, the probability of the Chinese invasion failing jumps to 80 or even 90%.
So Japan is literally the difference between China succeeding and facing an almost certain military catastrophe. That is an incredible amount of strategic leverage.
It is. And we haven't even talked about U.S. base dependency. U.S. military operations in a Taiwan scenario rely heavily on access to bases in Japan, especially the huge facilities in Okinawa, which are the closest and most capable launch points for air power and logistics.
So what happens if Japan says no? If they choose neutrality or just won't grant access for combat missions?
If Japan, for its own political reasons, refused to allow U.S. combat sorties from its territory, the U.S. ability to fight is drastically reduced. Several think tanks have run this no-access scenario, and the conclusion is often that the U.S. would, quote, suffer a crushing defeat.
A crushing defeat.
Because U.S. forces would be forced to fight from too far away, from Guam or even Hawaii. You just can't sustain that kind of fight effectively.
That makes Japan's political decision the absolute sine qua non, the one thing you must have for the U.S. to succeed. They hold all the cards.
And that creates this immense strategic tension. On one side, the U.S. needs Japan to participate to win. But on the other side, Beijing's threat is explicit. China's official line, which gets amplified in their state media, is that any Japanese intervention would immediately make the Japanese mainland a target. They talk about risking annihilation.
That is a direct existential threat against another country. Japan has to weigh the risk of saving Taiwan against the risk of seeing missiles fall on Tokyo or Osaka. That makes the decision to intervene almost impossible to pre-commit to.
And that delay, that political hesitation while Japan debates what to do, that's exactly the window of opportunity China plans to exploit in the opening hours of a war. The clock starts ticking the second China attacks, and the alliance has only hours to get on the same page politically.
Okay, so let's shift from the actual fighting to the strategy and the preparation you need to win, or even just to deter, because the alliance itself, its architecture, is facing some big challenges.
It is. To really win effectively, the U.S.-Japan alliance needs a huge modernization push, especially in what's called command and control, or C2.
C2 is basically the brain of the whole operation, right? How they talk to each other, how they make decisions. What's the problem with the current system?
Well, historically, alliances often operate at what you'd call an integrated level. Think of it like two different companies that share an office building. They cooperate, they might share some resources, but they have their own bosses, their own IT systems, and their own separate plans.
And China's moving much, much faster than that.
Exactly. To deal with China's operational speed and its cyber warfare capabilities, the U.S.-Japan alliance has to move to a unified C2 structure. This is like those two companies merging into one shared brain. Forces could seamlessly switch between U.S. and Japanese commanders depending on what the situation demands.
And if they don't unify, what's the danger there?
The danger is that seam in the alliance. If Japan is focused on defending its own islands, or while the U.S. is pushing for strikes on the mainland, that lag in coordination gives China a huge tactical advantage right at the start of a crisis. The enemy always exploits the gaps.
That gap gives them the time they need to establish a foothold before the Allies can even get their act together.
Right. And now let's look at the U.S. Navy's main strategy for this, which is called Distributed Maritime Operations, or DMO.
This is the idea of spreading all your ships out over a huge area so they're not an easy target for China's missiles.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
Survive the initial missile storm. But the war games show that DMO puts a massive strain on two critical things. First, C2 resilience. It's just harder to talk to ships that are scattered everywhere, especially when you're under electronic attack.
And the second thing?
The second, and this is a huge one, is logistics. The war games show a, quote, severe deficiency in joint logistics and medical support for mass casualties when you're fighting a distributed war.
Can you break that down? What does a logistical failure actually look like in that scenario?
Think about fuel and missiles. If your destroyers are spread out all over the Philippine Sea, how do you rearm and refuel them when every supply ship is a target? The war games predict a breakdown in getting critical munitions and fuel to the ships that need them.
And the medical side?
Well, with up to 21,000 U.S. casualties, you need a massive medical system. But if you disperse your forces, you also disperse your medical assets. That leaves your field hospitals and triage centers isolated, vulnerable, and completely overwhelmed.
So we might survive the first wave of missiles by spreading out, but then we can't actually sustain the fight. We can't rearm the ships or treat the wounded. That seems like a massive weakness because a war with China isn't going to be over in a weekend.
It's a critical vulnerability that they have to solve. So that begs the question, how is China planning to exploit all of this?
Right. What's their counter strategy? Are they just hoping we failed to get our C2 right, or are they actively going after it?
Oh, they are actively going after it. The PLA's military philosophy is completely centered on the information domain.
Information dominance. We hear that term a lot, but what does it mean in practice in the Taiwan Strait?
The PLA sees information warfare, so network sabotage, jamming, cyber attacks, as the heavy punch they need to land to collapse our command system before the real fighting even starts.
So they're targeting the C4ISR, the command control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Basically, the entire nervous system of the coalition.
Precisely. They believe if they can blind and deafen the U.S. and Japan, if they can stop them from communicating and coordinating, then the physical fight becomes a lot easier. They want to attack the system itself. They're looking for ways to take out satellites or cut the undersea cables that carry all the battle data.
It's classic asymmetric warfare. If you can't beat their ships and planes one-on-one, you destroy their brain and eyes first.
And this is where we see China's really clever use of strategic information, what some people call the humble brag. There was this simulation released by a state-owned Chinese defense company, and it actually showed a PLA Navy destroyer getting sunk by a U.S. missile.
Why on earth would they publish a simulation where they lose a ship? That seems like a strange way to project strength.
Because it's not about showing weakness, it's about signaling confidence and intelligence. By showing they have super detailed knowledge of that U.S. missile, its performance, how it's launched, the tactics, they're sending two messages. First, we know exactly what you're planning to use against us.
Second.
And second, we are actively developing countermeasures, especially electronic warfare, to defeat it. They're projecting strength by admitting they see the threat, and they're confident they can handle it.
That's fascinating. So the military takeaway here is that an invasion is incredibly costly for Beijing. Japan is the key variable that can make or break it. And the real war might be won or lost in the communication networks before a single ship leaves port. The cost is it's regime threatening.
That is the perfect summary of part one. And now let's use that massive cost calculation to pivot to our central thought experiment. If the invasion is political suicide, why does the talk never stop?
All right, so we've established, based on some of the most rigorous military analysis out there, that the cost of an invasion is basically political suicide for the CCP. It risks the stability of the entire regime.
Right.
So if the rational math says don't do it, why does the political rhetoric, the military posturing, the threats, why does it all just keep getting louder? And this contradiction, this is what brings us to the core of our whole conversation today.
It's this theory that's gaining a lot of traction, behind closed doors in intelligence circles. And the theory is that the CCP wants the problem of Taiwan, not the territory of Taiwan.
And that idea just flips decades of political assumptions completely upside down.
It really does.
If they don't want the territory, then what's the point of all this? All the threats, all the military drills?
The purpose is internal, not external. And we can really frame this argument by looking at 4 pillars that strongly suggest Beijing is aiming for perpetual confrontation, not a quick unification. But this means we have to look past the official slogans and just focus on the cold, hard interests of the ruling party's survival.
Okay, pillar number 1.
Pillar number 1 is what we just spent all that time on. It's a cost thesis. The invasion is a political suicide pact.
We laid out the military price, but let's just nail down the political and economic fallout.
Right. So if China invaded, the international sanctions would be, well, they'd make the sanctions on Russia look trivial. They would push the Chinese economy back 15 or 20 years, almost overnight.
We're talking a total cutoff from the US dollar, from European markets, from all high-end Western technology.
A complete economic rupture. And the immediate domestic result of that would be a massive spike in urban unemployment, a collapsing financial system, and just a total freeze on investment. You have to remember, the CCP's stability is built entirely on economic performance. It's their social contract.
The deal they made with their people. We'll make your life better, and in return, you accept our rule.
Exactly. And Xi Jinping's power is completely tied to that promise. So an economic collapse plus the humiliation of a massive military defeat that dramatically raises the odds of a political coup or mass protests. The modern CCP is way more vulnerable to economic shocks than Mao's China ever was.
So the argument is that for any rational leader, regime stability, what they call the Lizi or core interest, has to be more important than the symbolic victory of unification, the Mianzi.
It has to be. A rational autocrat's first job is self-preservation. The political payoff for taking Taiwan, when you factor everything in, is a massive net negative for regime stability. But maintaining the status quo, even though it's annoying for them, is manageable. When you look at it that way, the choice is obvious.
Okay, so that's pillar 1. What's pillar 2? This is the one I find really fascinating.
This is where the political manipulation becomes so clear. It's the idea of losing the perfect external enemy.
Taiwan as the ultimate political tool.
It's the perfect functional enemy that the CCP could ever ask for. Think about it. They speak the same language. They don't threaten to, attack the mainland. They don't kill mainlanders.
It's the ideal target for manufacturing a very potent but very controllable sense of nationalism without the risk of a real hot war spinning out of control.
Precisely. Taiwan works as a perfect safety valve. When the domestic housing market is collapsing, or youth unemployment is skyrocketing, or a huge corruption scandal breaks, the party can instantly change the subject by blaming external forces or Taiwanese separatists.
You always need an enemy to point at, but it has to be an enemy you can keep on the verge of defeating forever. If you actually conquer them, your distraction is gone.
That's the explosion risk. If China actually unified with Taiwan, they would instantly lose their most reliable, lowest cost, safest source of nationalist fuel. All that anger and frustration that's currently pointed outward at Taiwan would immediately turn back inward, against the party itself, against corruption, against inequality. The internal pressure cooker would explode.
So the goal is to keep the heat on, but never let the pot boil over. What's the evidence they're doing that?
It explains why Beijing's reactions to things are always, exaggerated but precisely controlled. They have to make their nationalist base feel like action is just around the corner, but they can never let the situation get to 100 degrees and boil over into a real war. They need the tension at 95 degrees to justify their military spending and their political control, but they can't afford the 100-degree consequences.
That 95-degree versus 100-degree distinction is a perfect way to put it. Okay, on to pillar 3.
Pillar 3 is the ideological threat. It's the fear of the democratic poison. And we saw a small-scale live demonstration of this fear back in 2019.
Hong Kong.
Yes. The crackdown in Hong Kong revealed this deep, visceral fear in Beijing that the democratic ideas from a place like that can infect the mainland population through the internet, even with the Great Firewall.
And if Hong Kong was a small test case, Taiwan is the final exam.
It's on a completely different scale. Taiwan is a mature Chinese language democracy of 23 million people. That is a direct, living challenge to the CCP's core story, which is that only the party can govern Chinese people effectively. Taiwan is living proof that a Chinese society can be democratic and successful.
And that's way more threatening than dealing with places like Tibet or Xinjiang, which are culturally and linguistically very different.
Exactly. This is the same language, the same culture. Trying to govern Taiwan would be a nightmare. They'd have two choices. Either massive continuous repression, basically turn the entire island into another Xinjiang, which would be astronomically expensive and cause global outrage, or you let some form of their political system exist.
And if you let even a tiny piece of that system survive, the infection starts to spread.
You'd have a free press, opposition politicians, activists, all using the same language and cultural references to pump dissent into the mainland's internet. It's 100 times more dangerous than suppressing other groups because the ideological competition is direct. Concepts like free elections or accountability could spread like wildfire among China's educated urban class.
But hold on, let me challenge that for a second. China has the Great Firewall, the most sophisticated internet censorship system in the world. Couldn't they just block all of that influence?
That's a fair question, but the difference is the sheer volume and cultural relevance. The firewall is best at blocking foreign languages or things that are obviously political. But Taiwan's content, its music, its movies, its social media trends, is culturally seamless. It's politically poisonous, but culturally identical. It would be a nonstop information war against 23 million people who speak the same language. The risk of even a tiny percentage of that leaking through is just seen as unacceptable.
Okay, that makes sense. Which brings us to pillar number 4. And this seems like the most telling evidence for this whole theory.
It really is. It's the reverse strategy, the fact that they keep pushing Taiwan away.
If you really want to unify with Taiwan, why do you constantly do things that make the Taiwanese public hate you more every single year?
It's the ultimate contradiction in their strategy. If the goal was to win hearts and minds, their actions for the past decade have been completely irrational, perfectly counterproductive.
What are the big examples?
Well, you have the constant military aircraft flying into their airspace, which is just irritating and scary for people. You have the economic coercion, like banning small agricultural products, pineapples, groupers. It doesn't really hurt Taiwan's economy, but it's politically infuriating.
It feels like bullying.
It is. And then you have the intense diplomatic isolation, trying to strip them of allies, and the low-grade cognitive warfare online designed to make people feel anxious.
And what's been the result of all that pressure?
The result is that pro-unification sentiment in Taiwan is at a historic low. Their actions have actually sped up Taiwan's decoupling from the mainland and consistently pushed voters toward pro-sovereignty parties. Many analysts think their aggressive military drills actually helped the DPP win the 2024 election.
It's like, if I really want to be friends with my neighbor, I don't constantly buzz their house with a drone and tell everyone on the street not to talk to them. It's the definition of shooting yourself in the foot if your goal is actually reconciliation.
Which leads to the only logical conclusion. If the goal was real unification, these policies make no sense. The most logical interpretation is that these actions are designed to maintain perpetual confrontation. They ensure Taiwan never gets close to formal independence, which they have to prevent, but they also ensure it never gets so friendly that the Taiwan problem goes away and loses its value as that nationalist safety valve.
So they're maintaining this perfect state of high tension forever.
An adjustable, permanent, high-tension equilibrium.
Okay, so rationally, functionally, it seems they don't want it. But the official talk is completely uncompromising. Unification is tied to Xi Jinping's personal legacy. It's in the party constitution. There's even this soft deadline of 2035. If the smart money says don't take it, why is the official line so rigid?
This is where the pure rational argument kind of hits a wall. You have to bring in the human and institutional factors. First, personal legacy. The current leadership is completely tied to this national rejuvenation narrative. To back down on unification would be to admit the entire political story since 1949 is a failure. He'd look weaker than all of his predecessors.
They lit the fire of nationalism, and now they're sort of trapped by it. They're bound by the very thing they created.
Exactly. They can't just turn around and say, you know what, we ran the numbers, it's too expensive. And second, there's the military strategic need. The PLA doesn't think about governance risk or economic cost. They think about strategic position. And they see Taiwan as this crucial weak point in the U.S.-led First Island chain.
The First Island chain being that series of islands that basically contains China?
Right. And from the PLA's point of view, taking Taiwan punches a giant hole in that chain. It gives them free access to the Pacific Ocean and removes the threat of U.S. forces being based right on their doorstep. Military logic says you seize that position, no matter the cost to the civilian leadership.
So you have this ideological imperative from the leadership and a military imperative from the PLA, and they're both running headfirst into the cold, hard logic of regime survival and economic reality.
That is the core conflict, the profound contradiction they're facing. Rationally, they don't want Taiwan. It's too costly, it's too dangerous to govern, it would cause massive internal instability. But politically, they must claim they want Taiwan to legitimize their rule, to control the nationalist story, and to satisfy the PLA. They are completely trapped.
Wow, this has been an incredibly thorough and really complex conversation. We started with the brutal math of war, and we concluded that taking Taiwan is catastrophic for everyone, but especially for Beijing's own stability.
And then we moved to the counterintuitive political logic, showing that actually governing Taiwan might be just as big of a threat because of the democratic poison and losing their most useful external enemy.
So what this whole analysis really shows is that the CCP is facing this incredible dilemma.
The core finding is that the CCP fears having Taiwan and never having Taiwan almost equally. Both outcomes present what they see as an unacceptable long-term threat to the regime's stability.
Which means the most valuable asset for Beijing right now isn't the island itself, it's the Taiwan problem itself.
It's a perpetual political tool, a blank check that they never actually have to cash, but they can use it constantly to justify their authoritarian system, their huge military budget, and cracking down on any internal dissent. It's the ultimate political lubricant.
So if we look at deterrence through this new lens, the goal for the US, Japan, and Taiwan shouldn't just be to win a war. It has to be about making the act of invasion so immediately and obviously suicidal politically and economically that Beijing knows it's game over for the regime the second the first missile flies.
And that kind of deterrence needs more than just missiles and ships. It demands that unified C2 structure between the US and Japan, that single brain we talked about. And it requires a recognition that the economic and information fronts are just as important as the military one. The regime stability is the real center of gravity that deterrence needs to target.
And that brings us to our final provocative thought for all of you listening to mull over. If China's greatest strategic fear is losing its perfect external enemy and therefore losing its nationalist safety valve, could it be that Taiwan, by simply maintaining the status quo, by not declaring formal independence, and just by continuing to exist as this vibrant Chinese language democracy, is actually more strategically useful to Beijing as a perpetual tool than it ever would be as a unified, ungovernable territory?
It is the ultimate geopolitical tightrope walk. The safest path for Beijing might just be to continue the very problem they claim they're desperate to solve.
Incredible stuff. Thank you so much for walking us through this labyrinth of military facts and pretty radical political theory.
My pleasure. And to everyone listening, we just want to be clear that this was an objective analysis of strategic perspectives and available data. We're just offering these different interpretations to encourage critical, independent thinking, which is what Sip&Talk is all about.
If you enjoyed diving into this complex geopolitical puzzle with us, make sure you subscribe to the Sip&Talk podcast wherever you get your shows.
And hey, go check out our friend Micky's YouTube channel, Micky to Life. They've got fun memes and great travel vlogs, which is probably the perfect palate cleanser after all this talk about military conflict.
I could not agree more. We'll see you next time.